All right, so this last lecture here is going to be about the ethical philosophers. Now, there is going to be an optional lecture that I do suggest you watch because it's fairly entertaining about the Greek gods and goddesses and kind of the Greek mythology and their origin story, because we've covered the Babylonians and the Egyptians and all of these different origin stories. I think it's interesting to look at the Greeks' version of those origin stories. So I would suggest listening to that and watching it. It doesn't take that long, but it's super interesting. But this is really going to talk about the ethical philosophers and the major role that they play in the way that humans think about a number of important topics. And the legacy today is just as strong as what we talked about in the last lecture. So, to begin, to explain to you the timeline here as we move forward from where we left off with the bigger picture as, kind of history lessons trying to cover philosophy when it comes to the Greeks. And so we move into the 5th century BC, which would be the kind of golden age of Athens. Well, actually, the 5th century BC, the 400s. Sorry. And so, golden age of Athens is a place where we celebrate their democracy. We celebrate that it's a very free-thinking, very open society. It ends up with a lot of foreigners, which to the Greeks means non-Greek or just a Greek from a different city-state. And will come to live in Athens because it's so welcoming of artists and philosophers, poets, thinkers, so on. It's not a utopia. There's lots of problems, and we'll talk about life in Athens in the future. But we want to talk about the limitations of the democracy, and we kind of hit on that a couple lectures back, and we'll hit on it again some more later. But just understand, we're kind of in that same wheelhouse here. We're a little further down the timeline, but it is in Athens where most of this takes place for our kind of survey streamline purposes. Now, before we get to Socrates, we have the wealthiest citizens kind of hiring philosophers as teachers. And this is really after the natural philosophers. We have a group of people named or called the sophists. And they're basically private tutors because there's no education system to speak of in Athens that's public, but really the private institution would be to hire a sophist, and they're the ones who are going to go out and tutor the elites. And so the goal is, and this is kind of the big elephant in the room, right? That the seedy underbelly. The goal is for education for only the elites, so that they can be successful in politics, and nobody else, right? So they're going to hire sophist philosophers to teach their children because Athens is a public assembly, and when they vote on policy, power comes from the ability to persuade and the ability to persuade based on your rhetoric and your ability to argue, and that requires these tutors, right? And that way you can convince your peers to get what you want, and that's really the initial goal here. So I love this picture here. It kind of cracks me up, that you have, just they're teaching and learning and all of this. It's just kind of funny. It's like, oh, you got a Greek student here on his laptop, but obviously it's not. It's a tablet, kind of. It's got like a little stylus here, but it's really funny. But that's exactly what it looks like. So, but probably, obviously they're using a stylus with some kind of, wax or something like that and heating it up and erasing it. But it's kind of interesting that you clearly see that you have this kind of education system set up here. And again, that's to really make the rich richer to some extent. Because when you lump education in with political power, there's obviously going to be some problems with that. And again, that namely goes back to the sophists, who are very clever. They have a strong ability to argue. They're able to take on non-traditional ideas that they adopt into basically this combat tradition, right? The sophists are very cynical. They could take any side of an argument because that's their training, that there's nothing necessarily wrong with, those things in and of themselves. The problem is when you do this in a way that's dishonest, or at least intellectually dishonest, when you act like an opinion is your own, but it's really not. You're just making whatever opinion you want to make to further the agenda of the day, right? The agenda, whatever agenda you're taking on that day. And so today, the term sophistry still means, to be intellectually dishonest. And one of the unfortunate legacies, and here's where we talk about, the negative legacy, which we don't do too much. I try to be more optimistic and upbeat, but there's plenty of times in history that we have to do this. And one of the negative legacies is relativism. And relativism is just kind of that idea that truth is relative, right? Which is bogus. It's self-defeating. Truth is not relative. The statement itself can't be true. If it's self-defeating. And so if all truth is relative, then the truth that they claim is also relative and therefore not true and therefore self-defeating. So it's circular for sure. Truth needs to be something firmer than that, right? We know that truth, by definition, cannot adopt alternate views that contradict each other, right? Because one of them has to be true. Now, that doesn't mean we can't tolerate people with different views on things. That's a whole different issue. But truth itself cannot be relative. And unfortunately, these are really the first people who really do a whole lot of, truth is relative, and they'll take any side of a debate and basically make truth seem meaningless. I think we live out the consequences of that truth being meaningless in our culture on a regular basis today, and that's an unfortunate legacy here. And the simple truth is that you end up with these ethical philosophers, and these are guys you may have heard of before, coming into class, guys who are really reacting to the sophists, and we're talking about Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, right? And I guess we could say it in order: Socrates, Plato, and then Aristotle. They're interested in truth, like firm truth. And they also recognize when things are bogus. They call them out and say, that claim is bogus. And they kind of make you flush out your reasons and why you're saying what you say. But they're really interested in ethics and morals and virtue and these things that are rooted in the idea that some things are true and some things are false. So they react to these sophists with just truth, really, is what they're shooting for. In Socrates and Plato's day, the sophists had really given philosophers a bad rep. Everybody thought philosophers were just all sophists who were disingenuous and you couldn't trust them, and basically said a bunch of empty words. And then Socrates comes along and questions things and wants to, lead to a more virtuous society, and people hate him for it. So the ethical philosophers aren't interested in, ethics, morals, virtues, of course, and that's what people are saying about them. They're saying, no, these people aren't interested in that, but they are, and they're really also interested in how individuals relate to one another, good and bad, and how they can improve a society. And this is radically different from the sophists. So we're basically who were basically intellectual mercenaries that would do whatever they had to do, and they were all just wealthy elites that would talk you in circles and not really try and accomplish anything outside of what they wanted to be done in society, which is really corruption at its highest degree. So Socrates and Plato are actually against democracy itself because they live in an era where democracy had become corrupt. They live in an area where the vote's dominated by certain segments. Just, kind of sounds familiar, honestly. They lived in an area where democracy meant tyranny of the masses and that people were not able to have a voice. Basically, they didn't have rights. They were actually pushed into it. They realized that everyone needs to be governed better than what they were doing it. So maybe, they're a little guilty of throwing the baby out with the bathwater because of where they lived and the fact that democracy was kind of poorly implemented. But that was how radical some of these ideas are. They were against it because, it was being abused. Plato actually wanted a philosopher king, people who are trained in philosophy and virtue and understand how to rule from a young age, that they should be trained up and that this would make them benevolent rulers with some kind of power needed to reinforce good laws. Now you say this is, definitely, a pie in the sky kind of impractical thinking thing. But, hit or miss, it's kind of what happens, throughout the rest of the course. You get a good king, you get a bad king, you get a good king, you get an incompetent king, you get a very wicked king, and people totally suffer. And Plato's going, hey, we should just train people to be better kings. And that does kind of play out a little bit for a little while. Like Alexander, like he was trained to be a better king, and by Socrates or by Aristotle, I believe. And so basically, it was a good idea there that he's just trying to improve the system. He sees corruption, he's trying to improve it. So that would be nice, though, if you just had one person who was just a benevolent ruler who just never wanted anything for themselves, and they knew all the stuff about politics and economics and all of this stuff, and they were able to just do a good job for the people because they were good people. That'd be great. Yeah, but it's not going to happen. There's another one that I want to mention really quickly, and that's Xenophanes. And we'll come back to Socrates and Plato, but the point that really Xenophanes made was he wanted to challenge the structure of the government, and some of them are really kind of, to do that, you kind of have to challenge the religion of the day. And Xenophanes criticized traditional Greek religion. And it's profound. I mean, we have our own God, in our own image, or we have a God who made us in his image. They had gods that they made in their image. And he is basically saying, hey, this is messed up. These gods, why do we worship them? They're violent and angry. Zeus is a womanizer, which you can hear about in the next lecture if you choose to watch it. We can go on and on. He thinks that, it's actually, terrible that these polytheistic gods that, they created gods in their own image, and why are we worshiping them? And I think he has a point, and it's really interesting. It's not atheism. Some people think it is. Xenophanes thinks that there's an unknowable God who, is distinct and distant and abstract and really can't be known by humans, and he's not subject to human influence. Now, I'm like, okay, I can kind of get on board with most of that, right? Like, I can agree, you have to be careful. You don't want to, misstate any of that there, but he is kind of right on some of it. God is not controlled by humans, and God is not someone who can be manipulated by humans, and he is worthy of worship because of that. Because, if you can manipulate something and you can make it do what you want it to do, how can it be a God, right? Like, how can you worship it? And so I am glad that we serve a God that's holy and just and right and not influenced by humans and all of that. And we can pray, and of course, we know that we can pray to God and that he blesses us, because he loves us, and he assists us not because we do things for him. He hears our cries. And I think it's important that this guy kind of brought up that, like, hey, all of this mythology stuff around the gods is kind of ridiculous, right? Like, and so I think that he kind of, again, the Greeks really had some really good thinkers, and I really think that it was important to kind of look at how some of these guys put some thoughts together that really were profound and then were completely rejected by society of their time. I mean, absolutely rejected. And he actually gets in trouble for this. There's this anti-philosophic reaction in Athens, and these guys kind of have to, fight through that. And really, again, it's rooted in the sophists. But thanks to people like Xenophanes and all of these other, true ethical philosophers, I think that you really end up getting some interesting ideas coming out of the Greeks. A lot of the Greek philosophers are not actually raised in Athens. They're not Athenians, but they are Greeks. They're not Athenians, though. And so the Athenians mistrust them, and they're... Okay, hold on. Sorry. Something was acting crazy. I don't know what happened. All right, so basically... they're not Athenians. They're mostly foreigners. They don't get trusted, and they get called, elitists because because they think they're just these tutors, these sophists, right? And so it's really true, though, up until Socrates' day, and then Socrates comes along and he kind of sort of changes everything. And so we're going to take a little bit here on Socrates because he's kind of that big of a deal. He kind of has all these great quotes and Plato quotes, and he's a fascinating guy and one of the strong minds that discusses everything. And he really gets into all kinds of stuff. And so Plato actually is one of his main students, and he kind of takes some of what Socrates does and he really runs with it. And so his legacy really lives on for a long time. And it's really kind of an interesting person and time frame to look at because of what he is able to actually do. And so he develops these skills about thinking and talking about issues more deeply and things that we try and do, honestly, in this class, I hope. And it's actually a really powerful thing to be able to do. And he remains, as he was in his lifetime, kind of an enigma. He really didn't write that much, but he's considered one of the most influential thinkers of all time. He forever changed how people thought about topics, and all of our information, though, is secondhand. And among experts, a lot of it is disputed. He's kind of put on trial. He's killed by the Athenian court. Basically, the democracy executes him, but he's still founded this whole discipline in a lot of ways, and its influence is really felt far beyond philosophy itself. But in his day, he's basically a martyr for the cause. So in the coming module, you're actually going to read the apology to him, and so I'm not going to harp on it too much now. But the apology is basically Plato's version of the trial of Socrates. So let me introduce it for just a moment, and you'll see Socrates wants to find out who the most wise person in Athens is, and he goes to the Oracle of Delphi. So they're already talking about gods, right? And he's not totally against the gods, but the article says, well, actually, the oracle says, well, actually, you're the wisest person. And he's like, no, it can't be me. And he doesn't know. He's like, I know very little. I can't possibly be the wisest person. He goes around, he interviews all these people, and they all think that they know so much, and he realizes they don't know half of what they think they know. And therefore, unfortunately, yes, he is in fact the wisest person in Athens, precisely because he knows what he does not know. And then he's on trial, and that's part of his defense. It's all read, the rest of it. But he says the very important phrase, the unexamined life is not worth living. I think that's something that we should definitely think about. What does he mean by this? The unexamined life is not worth living if you don't take time to stop and reflect. Both your core values and make sure that you're enforcing those each day, that you're doing those to kind of flourish as a human being, that you're doing that to kind of, really help yourself not be on this roller coaster of up and down and directionlessness. And I think he's got a lot of great things to say in there. And whether it's Plato saying it or, using Socrates as his voice, or whether these are actually sort of quotes by Socrates, by Plato, that Plato wrote down, is difficult to say. But Socrates has an incredible influence. As a historian, it's a very thorny issue to try and figure out Socrates, at least from Plato's historical representation of him. And we just have to run with what Plato tells us. We can be skeptical, but if we do that, then we might just say we don't know anything about him at all. So I prefer to think that Plato generally tried to capture the real Socrates. So Socrates is very influential, and he's considered by the Athenians to be this subversive radical. He didn't go around and attract people by asking questions necessarily, but he did establish this process of asking questions. It didn't make him very popular, but he did do it anyway. And this becomes known as the Socratic method, which you may know also from other classes, where you basically continually ask the person why when you ask them questions. And basically the idea is to get them to articulate why they view something that, that they've think or whatever, and then they are able to come to a conclusion. And although it's kind of annoying, it's very powerful. It's very important to ask you to elaborate or explain yourself. It really makes you think about why you are making an argument about something. And so, like, you can't just have assumptions. You have to be able to actually kind of go to the science of something, or actually have some concrete reasoning to really look at why you believe it. And then by asking questions about your evidence, then you can find out whether your stance is correct or incorrect or useless or wrong or whatever, right? And so it's kind of interesting that this idea of this Socratic method, and people, think, oh, well, this is going to limit what we can know. And it actually opens up people's minds. And it really opens up what people can think and learn and see, and they realize they're not perfect and all of these things. And Socrates really pisses some people off this way. They get really annoyed by him, and he gets put on trial for atheism, for not believing in the gods, and for corrupting the youth. And you'll see that the apology, what the reaction is to that. And I think that you could really ask, and what I want you to think about is he even trying to get an innocent verdict, right? Is he trying to be acquitted? So again, Socrates has this incredible legacy, and he is, I think, probably the, kind of like the Benjamin Franklin of the ancient Greeks, I guess. And he actually had so much knowledge, but he couldn't answer all the questions that everybody had, but that's okay. It's very important to recognize just how important Socrates is, and how important questioning things is, and how it makes us human society, and makes us think about our assumptions, and what bigger legacy can there be than that. Now, at this point, let's talk about Plato. Like Socrates, the unexamined life is, you have the famous line, but that's in a work by Plato talking about the Socrates stuff. And Plato's his main student. And once you begin to read Socrates and Plato's dialogues, you see an old philosopher that is really sort of a sassy, funny guy sometimes. And he's kind of fun, but he's a European, or he's like, sorry, my kids are yelling in the other room. I'm trying to listen to what they're yelling about. Hold on. So Plato is kind of like the absolute Mount Rushmore of human thinkers of all time. In his works, he kind of wrote as much as anyone in ancient history. I mean, we have about 30 to 40 of his works, and a lot of them are actually rough drafts from like lectures, and then the final is more cleaned up versions of, and some of those don't survive. But we have some of his early writings, which are absolutely brilliant. Really, really interesting things to go and read, and even teach about. Topics of justice and what does justice mean in a republic, and Plato asks, what is justice? And he and Socrates is the character that he's asking, Socrates, and no one gives a good answer. Some people say it's like giving someone what they owe, and he says, okay, so you borrowed someone's sword and they come over in a drunken stupor and ask to have it back. Is it just to give him the sword when he's drunk? And of course the answer is, well, no, that's a bad idea. She's like, so it's not just giving someone what is owed, right? There's more to it than that. So you have to think about other things. And he goes on and on to really get people to question justice. And he never really gives a perfect answer either, because the point is to continue to wrestle with things. And I think that there's a lot of relevance for us today with all of that. But Plato is also interested in instilling virtues to improve society. And The Republic is a book all about trying to make the perfect society. He also believes in what's called the forms. And the forms are just for everything that you could talk about. And for an aspect or an attribute of virtue is the most important thing to talk about, and to choose to talk about it. And with any virtue, there's a form of that virtue that, that all other virtues can kind of relate back to. And so it's kind of this goodness that derives from all other goodness, and that drives our ability to analyze whether something's good or not. And it's a very intellectual exercise, but very profoundly impactful to people because they realize that something higher is going on than just these kinds of virtues that we see and think we know of. Now, he's the main teacher for Aristotle, and Aristotle is his most important student. And just like Plato, we can go on and on and on about Aristotle. He again has a legacy that is staggering. Aristotle has some of my favorite quotes for him. Just give two of them to you. He said, "Educating the mind without educating the heart is no education at all." And then we are what we repeatedly do, right? Excellence then is not an act, but a habit. And so those are two pretty good ones. And so he'll take this idea to Plato that Plato has, that there's these forms of virtue, and just, how you need to study capital justice. And Aristotle says, yeah, that's great, except you would never call someone you would never call out someone who just does unjust things. So to be just, you have to do just things. And he takes a lot of the stuff that's kind of up in the clouds, and he brings it down to the ground level. If you want to if you want to develop virtue of generosity, start giving things away, right? He says, don't talk about it, be about it to some extent. And he would just talk to his students. And, it's sophisticated jargon. It sounds a lot like gibberish, and it's all these weird scenarios and hypotheticals. And it turns out much later, perhaps, that the Greeks really benefit from it, even though they may have been annoyed by it at first. But really, the Greeks take what Aristotle said, and they really try and become more down to earth. They figure out how to be just and virtuous and how to change and fix society. And it's a much more than just a bunch of arguments. It's practical, real world application. So for Aristotle, he studies practically every academic field and lays a foundation for almost all of them. In science, he goes through and he categorized his nature. We still use the basic idea when we do genus and species and animal kingdoms and all stuff like that. He starts a lot of that. It's staggering significance for universities and colleges down to present. Probably safe to say one of the most important people that ever lived, right? He transformed most, if not all, areas of colleges and academia that he touched. Later philosophers simply refer to him as the philosopher. He wrote as many as 200 treatises or like little works, and about 31 of them survive. Most of them are just his notes. Like we said, he influenced the great Romans, great thinkers of the Middle Age. He provided the predominant scientific paradigm. And his views are so influential that there's no way to overstate it, that his reasoning is pretty much impeccable for the data that he has. The properties, the way he looks at the properties of scientific data and how he says, oh, this is wrong with it and this is what we need to do to fix it and how we need to examine it. It really allows humans to flourish and develop good habits and become virtuous. There's a lot of truth to the idea that, examining yourself and trying to stay virtuous you can't argue with it. And that was really what Aristotle was about. And so it really is kind of this three guys that just change history. I mean, more than any, from an academic standpoint, it's not even close, these three guys. So the last couple groups here, you have the Epicureans, the Skeptics, and the Stoics. The Epicureans, they say, hey, pleasure comes from knowledge. The Skeptics, no position. They take no position, political, moral, social issues, because they have doubts about knowledge, and they aim to live without belief. And we still say, the word skeptical still kind of means the same thing. But the Stoics sort of believe in universal humanity and that the individual has a duty to others, which I think as Christians we can agree with, even if we aren't, universal in terms of what faith claims. We should certainly recognize the value of one another. And the Stoics' goal was to live virtuous life by avoiding the anxieties of life, and to have you know self control and kind of indifference. And that's where I kind of think you get the problem. I don't think there's anything wrong with having strong opinions and emotions, but they thought that those things were trapped, right? And that the idea was to let them out until you kind of got to the point where you just like didn't care anymore. And that's not, particularly a good idea. But that kind of brings us to an end here of archaic Greece and the Greek philosophy. And then again, I suggest you check out the Greek Gods lecture because it's really good. And then we will have our unit test this week as well. So we'll have a review for that as the week goes on. Thanks.